nacional sobre reparaciones de la esclavitud
About reparations for slavery and colonization from Caracas, Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela. This is the fourth class and the last class of the third session with our friend Rebeca Igreja. This week's or this few past days, the church celebrated the anniversary of Saint Raphael Archangel. And I remember an image of a Saint Raphael that was white who was defeating a devil that was black. That is the image that we all know about Saint Raphael. So I wanted to share with you a text of Eduardo Galeano. It's a short text, which is titled, The Devil is Black. As the night, as the sin, the black person is the enemy of the light and of the innocence. In its book of trips, Marco Polo evoked the inhabitants of Zanzibar. They had a very large mouth, very gross lips, and a nose that was similar to the monkey's nose. They were naked and they were totally black. So whomever saw them in any other region of the world would think that they were devils. 3 centuries later, in Spain, Lucifer, painted in black, entered in a fire cart and the fairs. Santa Teresa was never able to get rid of him. Once she stood by him, and he was an abominable black person. On another occasion, she saw that a red flame came out of the black body when she sat on top of her book of prayers, and the book was burned in America that had imported millions of slaves. It was Satan who played the drums in the plantations, calling people to disobey. And they played music and they danced with their children who were born to sin. And even Martin Fierro, who was in Argentina, who was poor and punished, felt good comparing himself with the black people who were even more screwed than him. This is what the devil made them for the hell. This is a text that is a bit interesting. Here, Galeano is talking about how the black race is seen by the Western people. This text that is called God is Black. There's another one that is called God is Jewish, God is a woman, God is black, and is the vision of the European white towards the black people, which is mainly the vision that we are fighting. They are the other ones in any case. But I wanted to share this with you. I think Galeano is great in the way he writes. And he talks about these things that lead us to think about our history, about where we come from, who we are. It's a reflection that we have to keep in mind constantly. So welcome you all once again. Today is Friday, October the 6th. Welcome to this seminar about reparations. Isamar, I give the floor to you. Thank you, Guillermo. Good morning. Welcome you all to this space. Today we will close not only this sessions that we have had, which have been held by Rebeca Igreja, but we end the third seminar that we have been having since August. During this week, we have been reviewing with Rebecca the political history of Brazil. We have talked about the racism that is enshrined in the policies of whitening and racial equality. We have reviewed the particularities of multiculturalism as a proposal that questions and responds to the racist policies. And yesterday we were talking about the affirmative actions as a policy for recognizing and for social justice. Today, for the closure, we're going to continue talking about all other topics with Rebecca, with the idea of listening to your participation. We want to hear the attendees' ideas, and I believe that today's session is going to be focused more on a conversation amongst ourselves. We want to listen all of your ideas. And well, without further ado, we are going to begin with this dynamic. Thank you very much, Rebecca, and welcome once again. Well, good morning. Today is the last day, and as you said, this is a moment where we would like to have a practice that is interactive, because I do believe that what I have talked about Brazil is not like an example. It's how things should be. On the contrary, the Brazilian experience to for me be to share with you what type of solutions and how we have discussed our problematics of racism. And as I have mentioned, we have many doubts. We have doubts. We wonder, we ask ourselves many questions, and we are quite aware of the fact that what can serve for us might not serve for other specific contexts. At the same time, we always reflect on what we have in common, what we can share. And this is why it is also very important to listen to what you have to say. Because throughout this week, after being here and after listening to you and talking to you, I began to have some questions. I have made some reflections on the situation of Brazil and on the policies of affirmative actions. Always with the idea that is very present, and that is how to work with policies that in the end are quite focalized, are quite individualized, and are related to a project of state with collective policies, with changes and social transformations that are important. I am always very careful in order not to just talk about adjustment policies and small reforms. We have to propose something that is much more broad, more ample, something that can really transform the society in order for us not to be susceptible to the great changes and to the risks, like what we just saw in Brazil, where we had a government that put all the political or social policies behind. So these reflections come to our mind. All these policies are very recent. We can say that we are in a space of inver- of creation, because actually what we are managing all the time is a creativeness. We have to think on how to do things, how to make things work. And this is very important. In this space where we try new things and we see how they work, when it's time to look for other ways of doing things, we have to see what are the risks of the things that we do. And in this sense, I would like to mention a few things that help us with this conversation. One element that is very important to clarify: what I have brought to you is not a something that is unanimous. No, there are many perspectives, there are many social movements, there are many, so as to call them, recipes of how we can do things. And when we have this discussion of identities, when we start discussing about the demands of recognition of different diverse identities like women, African descents, indigenous people, indigenous women, sexualities, people with disabilities, which is what we talk about in Brazil, older people. So this has been a challenge. It has been a challenge to understand how we can work with all these demands in a combined manner within the state, not only within the state, but also in terms of organization of the population, of the social movement, in order us not to weaken the capacity of organizing the massive movement that can actually challenge the structures of power. These are reflections that we do all the time and that lead to many doubts. So, where should we focus ourselves? And since many years ago, having the focus only on the social matter without considering all the other demands can also be one way of discrimination and racism, without taking into account the specificities and the demands of these groups. So it is very important to have this in mind as well. When we talk about this systematic methods, we always think about which is the theoretical framework we're going to use. I'm not only talking about from an academic point of view, but as you all know, the theoretical frameworks and what they say regarding the concepts that we use, regarding the way we define things, is very important. So we can resort, we can discuss about this matter based on a historical revision of revisiting history itself and all the things that history brings, eccentricims, the myth of modernity, the evolutionist theories, the racist theories that has classified the world, the civilization theories that have also put us in a very subordinate situation. We can also resort to small concepts that have political impacts that are quite significant, such as development. What does development mean? What type of development are we looking for? What do social assets mean? The consumption assets. What does means development? What does it means to have access to consumption assets? We know that we have a huge challenge right now, and that is the new technologies that have brought a whole series of important transformations in politics and the interconnection of the different ways to see and to live. Because when we talk about new technologies, we think about the impositive globalization that make ideas fit very quickly and that values and ways of forms are imposed globally. But also, we know that at the level of the social organization, the social networks and the global communications also transform the way in which we act. We act in a global manner. We use the social media. And even though this can all have a very negative part. It can also be appropriate in a very positive manner. But when we discuss about the new technologies, we also say that who controls them and what are the ideas that they have. And the most important thing is what is circulating in the world of social media, what is circulating in this global communication, what does this mean? So we have tried very little, but this is something that we must bear in mind, and that is the influence of the new technologies of information, of social movements that are global, of ideas that are disseminated very quickly, and that on many occasions we are not able to follow them. The feeling that we have in the academia, and I don't know what your experience is that as soon as we start to understand something, then a new thing arises. As soon as we start to understand and to work with a concept, suddenly there are many other concepts, other identifications that are invented and they are multiplied. So we don't have enough time to reflect on them. And sometimes this is quite complicated because we are now in a moment where there is a production of conclusions and reflections that are very quick. There is a phenomenon, and on the next day, we are writing and interpreting that phenomenon. Very quickly, we have to give an interpretation to that phenomenon and know what's happening. And this is something that happens very quickly in an impulsive manner without much reflection. And we fall with this trend. We follow this trend. And suddenly we say, we cannot talk this way, we have to talk this way. We cannot think that way, we have to think this way. So we start to feel overwhelmed by the situation. And many of the former ideas are displaced without promoting a theoretical framework that includes the reality that we are living, which is a very complex reality, a very complex reality. If we take as an example the academic world, today the academia is disseminated, circulates a lot. We've become an elite that is everywhere in the congresses. They publish in journals, they talk with other academic centers. So all the time our information is being disseminated, and we are always contributing with new ideas. And we can always say that finally we continue accrediting large global theoretical frameworks for all the situations. And sometimes we fall in the same fashions and we want to apply all these interpretations to all the situations that we have confronted. And even though we like the paradigms, we are not always able to respond to all the situations that we live. That is why I say that we are always in this space of the creation, of the invention, always taking into account that everything is considered from a political point of view. And since what we do in the academia and when we disseminate this information, we can never leave aside the fact that there is also an academic geopolitics, that there is a whole set of imposition of an academic elite that is established.
Que estamos haciendo y a veces como se toma, por ejemplo, la academia, en todo lo que hemos discutido de las cuotas, de las acciones afirmativas, de lo
If I take the academia and everything we have discussed, the quotas, for example, regarding our research, the academia is still permeable. And in the center, we still have to receive all of these transformations, not only in the discourse and in the works, but also within itself, the way we adopt these new theories, narrative, because we continue working the same way in a corporate way, closed to new knowledge, with a lot of resistance to internal transformation. In the evaluations we do of affirmative action policies, at the level of academias, one of the spaces that quotas in which the public service works with the greatest difficulty is within the contest assessment for professors. For example, we have 3 positions available with an open contest. There, the quota should be applied. And what we see usually at universities is that they open a contest and Afro-descendants, indigenous, and other groups of minorities, and not even minorities in some cases, have a lot of difficulties for winning the contest. And the greatest majority continues to be white, and at a reduced proportion white women. So how can we take these theoretical frameworks, these new discourses, but at the same time, it is so hard for us to receive these structural changes within the academia. And this is very frustrating. We that work with these themes, we see our colleagues, our departments, and it is hard for us to see such a structure at universities. And this happens at all areas of university, not only within the sciences, but also within social and humanities studies. And that's why we must include the quotas within this structure. Everything is so political. This has to do with spaces of privileges in which they are protected and guaranteed since many centuries ago, and they are very hard to transform and very hard to change. And affirmative actions aren't always enough to promote all of these transformations. So once again, for us, we have a research lab on this theme. There's an issue that's important for us, which is inequalities, theories of inequalities, how inequalities within this structure are based on the structure itself. There have been studies on inequality, and the question is, why should we work on the basis of inequality and not in the basis of equality, of equity? And what we usually read is that equity is almost like an utopia. We are constantly looking for it, and it is hard to define it. Who defines equity? What's the meaning of that word? And if we take the International Index of Wellness of Human Development, who is defining this international index? Who defines what poverty is? Is poverty the same in Latin America? Does it mean the same in India? Does it have the same meaning in Europe? How does India define poverty? Who defines the minimum amount needed for surviving? Is it the minimum regarding food, regarding wellness, and does it mean to have a dignified life and not suffering discrimination? However, inequality is easier to measure because inequality kills people, and not only through hunger, but also through the non-recognition, the lack of dignity, low self-esteem, the elimination of the ability of development a population can have. How many talents are we wasting because we are rejecting them and denying them opportunities because of discrimination, because of racism, and we block the access to knowledge and information to certain parts of the population. How many Black young people that are assassinated in Brazil could become great scientists who have a great capacity of development? And something I haven't mentioned yet is that when we discussed quotas in Brazil, the greatest critic was that the quality of public universities would be reduced because the youth is not prepared. They don't have the level to follow the university courses because they come from public schools that are worse in quality. And what has been demonstrated is that after a year, this sector of the young population reach the same level as their peers in universities. And when they are in this environment, these young people start to have all the competencies necessary. But their peers from the elite will not invest the same amount of effort than the other groups of the population that are for the first time in those spaces. So it is a lie that these young people will not reach the same level as other students. However, we cannot demand these young members of society to do a greatest effort, that they have to work 2 times what a member from the elites would have to do when entering the university. It is also fair and necessary that universities, schools give support and leveling so these young members of society can insert in universities. And this is something that's often invisible, and different elements start to be added to the discussion. the improvement of public schools, improvement of education, support, assistance, continue providing scholarships so they can stay at universities. And this is not part of affirmative actions, but it is part of structural policies that must come from primary education and the way they are seen. Before talking about affirmative actions, the Ministry of Education, when I was working close to these schools, how many cases did we have with comments from professors that would saw a poor black child and would tell their parents, we don't have to push that child that much because since it is a poor black child, he will probably never go to university. And that way, from the beginning, you start sending the message to these kids that they have a limited access to a good education in the future. The creation of technical schools is important that aren't at a university level. However, there's an evil discourse. Since people is poor, we must invest in technical schools so they have an immediate job, and that way they won't go to universities, and that way elites can have those spaces at the universities. How many talents are we throwing into the trash because of this way of thinking? So it is fundamental to take into account that affirmative actions with focused policies are not enough when fighting against inequalities or poverty because it is limited, it is temporary, it is based on quotas, and it is small because I think Brazil has around 250 million inhabitants, and if half of them are Black people, affirmative actions are not the ones that are going to solve the issue. And there's also a drama regarding the fact that the number of universities has doubled, but the number of postgraduate diplomas offered, degrees offered, cannot be compared to such a small amount of students going to those, choosing those degrees. Since colonization, it was said that studying was for the elites. Women were not able to vote, illiterates were not able to vote, and we only got the right to actually vote after the year 88 with the new constitution. So we have a history of power control on the hands of the elite. So discussing about inequalities is fundamental and the way they are manifested in different areas. This is a matter of reflection that's fundamental. We continue inventing new names, new concepts, and I am not against them. I use them, but we must reflect on that. Transversal and intersectional policies, interculturality. These are just attempts we continue doing in order to find a visible way to show that not everyone is the same, is unequal in the same way. Some people face more inequalities than other people. But what's the objective? when discussing structural inequalities that are part of our history. There are some elements sometimes we don't discuss. Citizenship. What's citizenship and what's the meaning of being a citizen? When I remember Pablo González Casanova, who had proposed ethnic citizenship, how could we rethink citizenship incorporating other citizens? And why is it important to discuss citizenship? Because it involves political participation. How do we integrate the participation of all members of society? Political participation, what steps should we take? We have a left deputy. She's a transsexual, transgender person, and she's extremely smart. If you ever have the opportunity of listening to Erica, it is very certain how she brought the issue of sexuality for discussing it within citizenship and state matters. And Erika Nieto is part of National Congress, even in commissions that discuss fiscal matters. She always repeats,
el problema de no respeto a la sexualidad.
we're not only going to be involved in debates regarding our issues within society, because we must talk about other issues, economy, project, taxation. So we must also be part of debates of issues that affect us directly. So she's always bringing this issue of citizenship and becomes a great leader of homeless people and their rights. She's working with citizenship and the rights for people that are homeless. How can they participate in the structures of state? How can they benefit from state? How can we can address and respect their rights? She also discusses her experience both within a more broad perspective of citizenship, and that's why we must establish which project of citizenship and how can we foster a democratic project that includes these people in all fields. That's why we always say that the indigenous issue is not only regarding the indigenous, it is a state issue. So, for example, we discuss the indigenous from the Amazonian region and we talk about Yanomamis. This is not only about protecting Yanomamis, but also talking about what's the meaning of the Amazonian region of the Yanomamis within the National Development Project. What kind of examples can they bring for the national discussion? Because if we only use examples from Sao Paulo, from Brasilia, from Rio, economists that are constantly discussing state and economy projects without including the perspective of these populations, and then we have a commission from a department, from a ministry, this is the one that's going to deal with them.
But all the projects of development overlook what can affect this population. That is, if we have not been able to create an interlocution, a citizenship interlocution that can be able to sit down and discuss about these projects jointly, this is something that is a very quite difficult challenge when we talk about recognition policies. The impression that we have is that we are still in at the level of recognition policies, but we have not reached a rediscussion policies of the national project. How do we integrate this population? And there are many very interesting things that happened during the Zapatista uprising. And what they said was that the experience that those populations have are good not only for themselves, but also for the state as such, for the country as such. We can learn by the way they live. And this have always been the risks that permeate when we focus only on the focalized policies of recognition.
Bueno, me falla a veces una palabrita en español,
Sometimes I forget words in Spanish, but it is necessary to advance. That is, we cannot stay in this point because this cannot be a summation. We have to think on how we can integrate and build something that is differentiated regarding policies. And the other thing I would like to discuss is that citizenship takes us to talk about national identity. When Manuel Valenciana says that what we have today is a crisis of the state and the nation in the world, I believe this is very important. The redefinition of the national identities, how we rethink about them, and how we still think about this nation in a much more multicultural situation, not only for the recognition of differences, but how can we communicate ourselves with this difference? I mean, how can we adapt ourselves and how can we learn to treat these differences? Because sometimes we have to be very honest and we are confronting and living with different ways of life. And the quotas were very important for this in the universities. When you go into a classroom and when you find students that are transgender, some of them have problems with their vision, sometimes they have problems for walking, or they have hearing problems, etc. And we, as professors, have to find a way to teach for indigenous students. I have students that are indigenous, I have students who are Black, I have students from the elites, and we are all working together. The sensation that I have sometimes is that we use which words can we avoid in order to not offend them.
Decir, ¿cómo puedo estar atenta para que
How
no...
can I be attentive? So this goes beyond the accusation or the evil of the other person. This is because we are learning to cohabitate amongst ourselves. We have to find then one way to learn, wonder, to ask ourselves how you want to be treated. That is my experience at class. It is very important to learn how to treat with this diversified audience and a defensive audience and an audience that is extremely defensive because since this is the first time we live this situation, the affirmative actions have been there for 10 years. They're very recent. So all of these topics are very recent And besides,
desde ya hace mucho tiempo, por ejemplo,
from a
con
long
los
time
niños,
ago with
es así,
children
los
in
niños que
Brazil,
tienen alguna
children who
discapacidad
have
mental,
some type of a
niños con
mental
autismo, no
disability,
pueden
children who have
frecuentar
autism,
escuelas
they cannot go
separadas.
to separate schools
Por norma, deben ser
due to a
integrados a la
standard.
escuela en la
They
misma
must be
sala
integrated in the
con
school and the
todos los
same
niños.
classroom with all the rest of the
El gobierno
children. And
Bolsonaro
the
intenta
Bolsonaro
realizar esto
government
hasta
tried
atrás de esta política
to
con un esfuerzo muy grande que no se
delay
podía
this
obligar a los
policy.
niños
There
de
was an effort that was
normales
made
convivir
where
con
they couldn't
otros
force the
niños,
normal children to
pero por
cohabitate with
suerte ahora
other
que hemos
kind of
regresado
children. But
a
luckily
regresar a
now,
la misma
we are
política,
now
los
respecting
niños
the same
deben estar
policy.
juntos
Children
en la
must be
misma sala. Hay
together
que
in
aprender a
the same
convivir
classroom.
con estas
They have to
diferencias.
try to learn
Pero
to
este es un reto
cohabitate with these
enorme
differences. But this is a
de hacer
huge
la sociedad
challenge.
comprender,
We have
de
to make the
educar a la
society
sociedad
understand that they have to
y de
accept
enseñar cómo
society.
hacerlo,
We have to teach them how to do it.
cómo se hace.
How do we do
Y
this?
esto todo lo digo para llegar a
And I
otro
say
punto
this
que les
in order
tengo para
to get to
discusión,
another element
que
for
es
us
el
to
punto
discuss
sobre
here,
la
which is an
discriminación
element that has to
y
do
el
with
racismo.
discrimination and racism.
Porque la impresión que
Because
tenemos
the
es como
impression that we have
hablamos mucho
is
de
that since we
discriminación,
talk a lot about
racismo,
discrimination,
prejuicio, como
racism,
si fueran
as
sinónimos.
if they were
Y son cosas
synonyms,
distintas.
but they are different
Y
things.
son
They're
cosas
different
que no
elements.
solamente
And
la
these are
definición,
elements
pero
that
legalmente
not only
tienen
due to
actos
their
que son
definition,
tratados de
but they
manera
have different
distintas.
impacts and they are treated
Porque cuando
differently.
hablamos de racismo,
Because when we
estamos
talk
hablando
about racism,
de
we're talking
representaciones
about
sociales,
social
de
representations,
estructuras,
about
de valores
structures, about
que se pueden,
values
que están
that
anclados
are
en esas
anchored in
concepciones de
these
superioridad e
conceptions of
inferioridad de una
superiority
raza y
and
relación a otra,
inferiority of one
o de
race versus
concepciones de
another race,
género, que
or
son
of
todas
gender
esas concepciones
conceptions,
que marcan
all these
estas
conceptions that
desigualdades.
mark these
Pero cuando estamos
inequalities.
hablando de
But when we are talking
discriminación, que
about
es un concepto, al
discrimination,
menos
which is a
políticamente,
concept
que
that
es
from a
muy
political
reciente,
standpoint is very
que es algo
recent,
que ha ganado mucho
is
espacio
something that
después de
has
los
gained a
años
lot of
90,
space after the 90s,
estamos hablando
we are
de
talking
actos
about
interrelacionales
acts that are
que marcan
interrelated,
las
that mark
relaciones de las
the
personas,
relationships between people.
que muchas veces tiene más
On
que ver
many
con
occasions, this
individuos
has more to
que
do with
con
individuals
estructuras.
than with
Es
structures.
cómo
And
actuamos
how
en
do
estas
we act
situaciones de
in
las
these
discriminaciones,
situations of
cómo
discrimination? How
intervenimos
should we
en estas
intervene with
situaciones
these
discriminatorias.
discriminatory situations?
Si tomamos, por
If
ejemplo,
we take as an
la
example the
constitución que tenemos en
constitution that we
Brasil,
have in
todas
Brazil,
las
all the
discriminaciones son punibles por
discriminations are
ley.
punishable by law.
Incluso ahora reciente
In
se
fact,
ha
recently
logrado y en la
in
Corte
the Supreme
Suprema
Court,
que la homofobia también
homophobia
sería
is also
considerada
considered
dentro del cuerpo
within
legal de
the
las
legal framework of the
discriminaciones que son
discriminations
punibles
that are
por ley.
punishable by law.
Pero lo que hemos
But what
debatido
we have
mucho en
debated
nuestro
a
grupo
lot
es
in the
que
group
no
is
sirve
that
solamente
it
punir
is not just
en el
enough to
momento que
punish
ocurren las
people.
situaciones
When the
discriminatorias.
discriminatory situations
Denuncias en la
occur,
justicia
there are
y esta
denounces,
persona
there are
pasa a sufrir
complaints,
un
and
proceso
the
penal.
person starts to suffer a
Es así que ha sido
penal
tratado en
process.
Brasil.
This is the way it has been treated in
Las denuncias son
Brazil.
todas a
The
nivel
claims or the
penal
denounces are
de la justicia
punishable,
penal.
are treated from a
Pero
penal
no
level,
hay
but there
protocolos,
isn't or there
guías
aren't
de
protocols, there aren't
intervención y de
guidelines for
prevención
intervention and
de
prevention
estas
of
discriminaciones.
these types of
No hay siquiera
discriminations. There's
dispositivos
not
legales en
there
el
are not
Código
even
Civil
legal
del Derecho
provisions in the
Civil
civil
que
field, in
tratam
the
de
civil
estas
law that treat
discriminaciones.
these
Y esto es muy difícil.
discriminations. And
Por
this is
eso que
very
digo, hay que
difficult.
avanzar, no podemos
We
estar
have to
solamente
make
puniendo
progress.
a la
We
gente,
can only not only be punishing
porque hay una
people,
contradicción
because there
muy
is a
fuerte.
very strong
Nosotros en
contradiction.
el campo de derecho, y
We
todos los
in the field of
antropólogos,
law,
pasamos
even
la vida
anthropologists,
diciendo
we spend our
que hay
lives
que
saying
pasar de la
we have
idea
to go from the
de
idea of
la
the
punición con cárcel para todos los
punishment
crimes.
with jail for all the
Hay
crimes.
varios
There are various criminologists in Brazil saying that they have to close the jails because this doesn't work. This is not a justice of transformation. This is not a justice that works, just sending people to jail. And we who work with racism and discrimination, wanting to incarcerate people is not the solution. So the contradiction is that we are resorting to a method, and this is something that we used to criticize. We spent our lives working with abolitionist theories, saying that we have to put an end to this discourse, which is quite present in Brazil, of sending people to jail. Brazil has the second or the third population that is in jail right now in the world. It's gigantic, the number of people who are in jail. And I don't need to say that more than half of the Black population, as I showed in the chart, and more than the population who is in jail without having passed the whole criminal process. And it happens that when finally there's a ruling, the person has been in jail for a longer time that he needed to be in jail. And a great part of the people who are in jail was due to minor crimes. There were poor mothers who stole a can of milk for their children. These women are in jail. There are very symbolic cases of people that are very poor that stole a chocolate and they are in jail for 2 or 3 years. Or the great proportion of Black people who are in jail are because they were carrying drugs. Now in the Supreme Court, they're voting in Brazil, carrying drugs was not penalized. But they did not mention the amount of drugs, and the Supreme Court is now establishing the amount. And the discourse of the Supreme Court was, if we do not determine this, what is happening is that the young people of the middle class and of the rich people who are white, when the policemen catch them with drugs, they are never sent to jail. And the Black youngsters can have a lower amount of drugs and they are immediately sent to jail. They suffer a process as if they were traffickers. So in the Supreme Court, they have to determine the amount of drugs because it is necessary to take these Black young men from the jails. And all the things that we see in Brazil of attacking the Congress, the Supreme Court in this moment has to do with this policy because they say that what the Supreme Court is doing is that they're liberating the use of drugs in Brazil. And there was something worse. They made a survey, and more than half of the population believes that any amount of drugs must be forbidden. So, drugs or narcotics are one way of keeping the young Black men in jail, in prison. And this is something that we have permanently discussed in Brazil. The jails were done for Black people back there. So how can we, while treating the discrimination and racism, how can we reinforce a mechanism that has failed? And the conditions of the jails in Brazil are absolutely terrible. You might have seen this in the movies. We are known due to our jails in Brazil and due to the massacres that happen in the jails. Besides the two criminal gangs that exist in Brazil, for example, the Comando Vermelho, which is well known, the PCC, all those criminal gangs have been born in the jails after the great massacres that happened. One of the worst massacres that happened in a jail where some of them died.
Y por
They were murdered by the police. So our concern is that today we have not discussed how we make progress in order to treat a discrimination that is not once again with the punishment in the penal law. So the next step is to see how can we make progress with guidelines, with protocols, with rules that will help us organize and regulate how to treat discrimination of all the different types of racisms. How can we create institutions that work for the reception of these denounces, of these complaints? How do we establish intervention agencies in case of complaints, like the ones we see of the supermarkets, of the companies? How to guarantee the control of the state on these complaints? And also, how can we make progress with education for treating these complaints of racism and discrimination? We have to leave the field of punishment to those who commit those acts. And in all these things that we have mentioned, there is a very important aspect to us, and that is how to discuss about the public and private administration. And I had mentioned this to you before. It's not good to only include people, but how this inclusion can transform the bureaucratic structure itself, the structure of the institution. Because if we continue working in the same manner with meritocratic principles, with neoliberal principles, and with the same type of operation, with the difference that today we have Black people and we have other type of people within this structure. So how can we revisit the formation of the administration courses, the private management courses, in order to discuss about the meritocracy, in order to discuss about training, about results, about the work in a differentiated manner? This is very important. There are international debates regarding these topics. The United States worked a lot with what they call the representative bureaucracy. But what they mean is to discuss how to include members of this diversity within the bureaucratic structures
de la
in
transformación.
terms of transformation. The European Parliament has made more progress. They have created agencies for the public and private sector to treat discriminations. The focus is more on how to create the reception of situations of discrimination in the public and private sector in a regular manner. As you all know, in Brazil, for example, there is a policy against the modern enslaved work. This is a very strong policy that was strengthened after the Constitution. There is a structure in the Ministry of Work. There is a structure of fiscals, of prosecutors that go around the country and that have the power to intervene in the companies and in the haciendas and to verify if they are workers who are slaves and if there are bad conditions, poor conditions of wages, maybe they're working longer hours. I mean, they are attentive to the types of works. And this is something that has made advances in Brazil.
And after that, they publish a list of all people, companies that are committing crimes of work. And in Brazil, it is called work similar to slavery. And every year there are dozens of denunciations. And in the case of domestic work, there's a high amount of women that are in situation of enslaved labor. Last year, they found a university professor that was had a domestic employee that did not receive a wage, that couldn't leave their home for years, and they would repeat to her, "Oh, we're taking care of your family. Oh, we're taking care of everything." And this is the worst legacy from slavery. And they treat these people as if they were their families. They see their children as if they were all children. And this is a discourse that generates a process of judicial processes that is similar to workplace. There was also a worker within the justice system that kept a deaf employee for decades at his house without receiving a wage. A wage. The first success in this case was to achieve a compensation for that person that was in that situation. But imagine women that are 60, 70 years old that spent their whole life in this situation far from their families. That's why it is essential to continue saying that it is within the families. And it is such a natural issue that there was a very famous journalist that came from an elite family in Rio and wrote an article in a newspaper about the importance of asking ourselves what families are. And that's why it was said that we can pass a law in which, when the wills are written, the employees that are part of families have the right to receive part of the inheritance of the family. So naturally, these employees, most of them are women, they should automatically have the right as children to have a part of the inheritance their of the heads of the family. So there's no need to say that during the Bolsonaro government, and we continue living these pressures in the National Congress to control this policy when talking about analogous work to slavery. And the people that defend, the politicians that defend this are receive threats. They must be protected by the police. This is a public career that has a great compensation monetarily, but the risk to their lives is immense. This, along with the ones that work with the environment, with the Amazonian region. So it is very complex when talking about the threats persecutors receive. Then the workers that were in Rio in the south, were also denounced as work analogous to slavery. But what's a good thing about social awareness? When it was known this issue regarding this wine company in the South, there was such a strong campaign on social media so people would stop buying wine from this company. There were people pasting and putting papers on the supermarkets that said, pay your slaves. And that translated into such a reduction of their sales and a loss on income. So making society awareness has a fundamental role when fighting to against these issues. And this is something we've seen in Brazil in the recent years. So I apologize for such a long discourse, but this is to realize that even if I talk about anti-racist policies, this is such a small thing we can do when compared to a massive world of discriminations that are repeated every single day and that we cannot forget. If we have a discussion at a level of recognition, we still have to continue going back and talk about inequalities, about state projects, national identity projects, citizenship, and how we can continue living together in order to build a better future, education, practices.
Es algo cotidiano.
Learning, this is a day-to-day matter. It must be thought and structured. And this is a concern I have when I see the announcement of new quotas, new percentages, and I ask myself, where are protocols, guides? How do we deal with these cases? Where's transition justice? How can we advance in these areas? So thank you very much. And now I give the floor to Guillermo. Well, now we will have a 15-minute break and then we will restart and give the floor to all of our attendees, our guests.
Cambiemos.
political and cultural movement of Caracas. I would like to first comment on the discrimination that's executed in Brazil regarding education. Here in Venezuela, there are also high levels of discrimination, but often hidden. For example, the education or learning isn't the same when comparing a Venezuelan student in the east of Caracas, the wealthiest area, when compared with the west area of the city. The message given to students in Katia, a popular zone, than students in Carimar in the east of the city. The education from the Emil Friedman or Loyola schools than the ones from Fermin Toro, which is a public school. My intention with saying this is that we were taught that there are three hard subjects: physics, chemistry, and math. And we had to fear these three subjects at school. And this message was received by students, causing that these three subjects became the greatest difficulties for students. Our education has been shaped for Bolivarianism, humanism. I think these subjects and that the learning within them is fundamental. Another element I wanted to ask you, friend Rebecca, is that we talk about racism a lot, but being conscious, aware that we aren't a race, but the human species. So should we continue talking about racism or talk about social segregation or social discrimination? It would be relevant to clarify this, or at least you could give us your opinion on this issue. Another element is regarding quilombismo, the quilombos. The term quilombo is accepted or popular in Brazil as a manner of organization itself. Are there Christian or evangelical quilombos, indigenous quilombos, and Afro-descendant or Afro-Brazilian quilombos? I'm saying this because if that's the reality, you have an advantage regarding the process that's been developing here. That for us is new, everything related to reparations. The Cumbes were recognized recently here, which it could be a parallel with quilombos.
Fue musical, nació en Caricuao, del
The
cual yo fui
first Cumbe here was uh, made up of musician along with me. It is Salcedo in the area of Caricuao. That was in the 80s. Then there was a research process and recognition of what was developed during the invasion process along with the Maroons. The social and organizational aspect is has been manifested just recently. We could be talking about 10 years. It is not that immediate. So if quilombos are recognized as they are in Brazil, you have some years of advantage because reparations and the recognition of cumbes here is also quite new. So those are the questions I have. Okay, let's try to have the following interventions to be more brief so everyone can have an opportunity to talk. We have two friends in queue. First, Stuart. I have a question. Are these final reflections? Could you maybe talk or share some recommendations or conclusions? Hi, my name is Yuraima Mata. I am part of the Bolivarian Foundation of Ethics and Social Development. I am also part of the Human Rights Movement from the Congress of the New Era. I am also part of the national movement of religion, beliefs, and worship. I would like to thank especially Rebecca for sharing her knowledge with us. This has been a great festival of knowledge, and I would also like to congratulate the team that's coordinating the event for such an a wonderful encounter. And I am here representing this organization so I can disseminate this information. We must multiply the knowledge we've been learning during all of these encounters for several months. We have some important recommendations that can be taken into account within this seminar. The first is fostering a committee of preservation and defense of the culture, food, music, religion, regarding reparations based on values, tolerance, recognition, and encountering, which would be important to create this committee from this space. Another important aspect to be taken into account here is a committee of human rights and defense according to reparations of Venezuela, because as it was said by professor, here in Venezuela, we still are in the path of developing this area. I know the Afro movement has been working on this issue, but we must support each other and we must recognize ourselves as Afro descendants, because if we don't do so, we cannot participate nor defend our rights. Another of the elements is to create a articulation committee and knowledge exchange from Latin America, because we've had guests from Latin America, and this along with the Afro movement that has been working on national and Latin American articulation to strengthen everything related to human rights. From the Knowledge Center and the Simon Bolivar Research Center, we wanted to propose to develop a course called Compared Studies of Venezuelan Religions, because here in Venezuela we must strengthen and emphasize the importance of the different religions, because this is related to encounters, reparations, knowledge. We, within the research we've conducted, knowledge and education was done from grandfathers to their grandchildren, fathers, and within communities and communes where family would learn from each other regarding reparations, regarding identity. So we must recover from these committees and strengthen the center of the families in which these values are talked about, the ancestry recognition we have lost. And lastly, introducing in some way defense, as it has been worked by Rebecca, our guest today, guest speaker, everything related to the articulation of racial discrimination in coordination with organizations at a Latin American level to defend everything related to discrimination and race matters. What have they done? How have they moved forward? And what we have done here from Venezuela in order to share this knowledge and strengthen ourselves in the path. Thank you.
We are going to have 3 participations first, then I have 3 other participations. We'll give the floor to Rebecca, and then we were going to have the questions that we have in the Zoom chat. Germano Soria from Science and Technology. Thank you very much to the organizers, and thank you very much to Rebecca for this exchange of knowledge. I have 2 comments, and please, I would like to know your opinion. Even though there is a legal regime in the countries where they recognize the originary peoples and the Black people, the human genome is unique, and the different classifications of the same is done, and they show that there is no empathy with the government agents for the recognition of each one of them. We are diverse in spirituality as a vision of the world and in the process of transformation of the social reality. We are oppressed by the political behavior of our governance. And another comment is the following: the administration of justice in the state has been blind, traditionally blind. It has been executed based on the economic power. The political affair is in vogue at the level of Latin America to annul the contrary. We saw this with Lula da Silva, Evo Morales, Pedro Castillo. If there's no justice, there cannot be change in the nation. Thank you. Rebecca? I'm going to be quite brief. In order to clarify, the quilombos that are recognized legally are the maroon community. And the difference is that before, in order for them to have a legal recognition, the lands had to have an anthropological study. And afterwards, in the first government of Lula, they passed a law, a bill, that was a self-declaration where they delimited the land, then they had the community, and they were Afro-descendants. And according to what you said, maybe it's worthwhile for you to study this. In Brazil, we have a cultural foundation that is called Palmares, on behalf of Zumbi de Palmares, who is the most important leader of the Quilombos. And this foundation is responsible for the cultural part, the religious part of Afro origin. And it is very important. It's historical, it's very significant. And nowadays, it is addressed, it is led by a musician who is the president of one of the musical movement that is most famous in Bahia, which is the Olodut. I don't know if you don't know Olodut, which is a movement of repercussion that is quite known in Bahia. If you don't know about them, it's worthwhile for you to investigate about them because it's very beautiful movement. And he's the one who leads the Cultural Foundation Palmares. And it is well structured. It is a foundation that studies history about the different Afro-Brazilian cultures. And I would love to be able to connect you with them. And about the clarifications that you made, mainly to talk about the religious subjects, but I am interested in knowing and learning afterwards about this field of defense of racial discrimination and how it is articulated, because we have compared studies in Latin America about this topic. And very quickly, regarding the comment and about the juridical question, yes, this discussion is a drama regarding the juridical field and its interference in policies. The Supreme Court is very critical. And then suddenly they have a democratic attack from the Supreme Court when Lula came to power. So we work with what we have and with what we can produce with our critiques. So by this, I think I have clarified in general. We are going to give the floor to another participant. First, I would like to congratulate you again for your presentation. The clear manner in which you have presented this phenomenon, because this is a phenomenon that affects society, both discrimination as well as racism. It is true, as you said, that these are two different terms, but they feed each other. One depends on the other. Racism needs that some kind of a cocktail that has three members: the science, religion, and political power. In all the spaces where there is racism, we have these three elements present. Even though it is true that you have presented the example of Brazil, we are very interested in the Venezuelan aspect. I am not Venezuelan, but I arrived here when I was a child, and nobody's going to teach me about the Venezuelan history because I have lived it. It is true that in Venezuela there's no racism from the Eurocentric point of view. However, there is racism. And many times people who all condemn discrimination with discourses practice discrimination with actions. That is where we need a focus for that metrics that we have here in Venezuela, which is different from what you might have in Brazil. For example, here in Venezuela, discrimination is more like a bullying. And the one who discriminates thinks he has the right to discriminate the other person, because if you manifest it, if you manifest your inconformity, he asks you, well, but why does it bother you if I'm just kidding? But we do understand that discriminating another person is to attack another person. That is why we consider that with those fora, not because I'm Black, because I don't suffer from racism, but we do need our community because the Venezuelan state has worked a lot. And a sample of this work is this seminar for the Venezuelan society to be calm, to have tranquility. In our cases, our children have even had to face this society because how do gangs initiate? Well, to defend themselves against the aggression of the other people. So this is what I wanted to contribute with. How can we develop fora to make our people aware, those of us who are sitting here, to take that message to our territory or to our people, for them to realize that not only because three, four, sometimes I get to a place and people say, oh, we ran out of electricity. That's the way it happens. I have 5 children, and 3 of them are quite big. And once one I was in a place, and 2 boys who were saying that to them didn't know that they were my children. So he said to the other one, "Oh, the light went off." And my older son said, "If you want, I can turn off the light, but using your teeth as a switch." And the guy stood up and left. And I asked him, "Why did you do this?" And he said, "Dad, is that necessary? Is that necessary for us? We have to understand the situation that the Venezuelan family, most of us, those of all who are aware of this, we have to show people that when they are discriminating, they're attacking the other person, and we should not do so." Stuart, and then the other comrade. Hello. I am going to take the advantage of the present of the speech of our former friend regarding the scheme that he's just mentioned, where the endo-racism seems to be an effective strategy, as you explained with the interracial marriages for Brazil, and the message of the dominant culture for the oppressed ones that reproduce that endo-racist dynamics. So for us, we have certain questions, and we would like to have your opinion about the attitude of the multilateral agents vis-a-vis the Afro-descendant causes, specifically in the case of the African nations and the Caribbean nations that have exposed, as of the 50s, causes that today can be considered as reparations and that describe somewhat that crisis that you showed. Then you mentioned in your work that from the revision of the agendas, you found that the agenda of reparations coincided with the Pan-African agenda. And you described the minorities. So how does the intersection of those agendas of the minorities vis-a-vis a citizenship proposal have an influence on the Afro-descendant vis-a-vis a new definition of citizenship that is proposed by the 2030 agenda? And finally, I would like to know your opinion about the manipulation of the history discourse and regarding the Afro-descendants, knowing your experience about the creation of categories in this process for multilateral agencies, which is a direct inheritance for anthropology, how this affects our public policies. And in the digital area, sometimes this is translated into the renounce to the rights conquered by the citizenship in terms of work and privacy. Thank you very much. Well, my name is Rafael Rivas Cabrera. I work for the university, and my work has to do with your presentation of this morning regarding the difficulties of the state when defining their public policies that are based on the concept of equality. In fact, that as a juridical concept is from the state. It is the fate that defines the homogenization of the population, of the civil society, and of the state's policies. That discussion, we have had it for a long time during the Bolivarian Revolution to get to the concept of equality, of equity, because equity is based on the conditions of the individuals and not on the perspective of the state on the development of the public policies. So this gives it, so as to say, a different nature to those policies, because then it is the conditions of the individuals, the ones that are going to define the objectives of the programs and of the government plans. And this is very important because, for example, in the case of the universities, we have been working with this subject. There are different difficulties, like in the case regarding access to universities, quantity or quality. It is a matter of creating more universities by decreasing the quality, obviously, because it is more transformed in quantity than in deepening in the quality of the education. In this case, in the university education, to be able to articulate them with the state policies, because the idea is to have an offer that has to do with the development plans, the national development plans. But then we have the individual part, which is something that we're working on right now that has to do with the vocational orientation. In the developed countries, this begins from the first educational levels. They start to define the characteristics of every child and of every teenager, of every young adult, in terms of channeling them, but based on the objectives of the development of the state itself. So there has to be a combination between the two aspects, the collective aspect, the national aspect, and the particular aspect, because we have individual differences, and this is what we have to capture. Here, for example, we have an organism that is ORSO, which is the Office for the University Planning, which up until 2018 developed a vocational pre-orientation at high schools to prepare them for universities. However, due to the pandemic, this was suspended and we have not resumed that. There's a proposal for the Ministry of Education to resume once again these departments in the high schools, to start working on this and to channel that, and not to have this distribution of high school towards the universities. We suppose this has to do somewhat with what you mentioned about Brazil, of how to channel the population of high school students towards university, but oriented based on the objectives of the national development plans, and also due to that particular aspect of the vocational orientation of these high school students. So we should coordinate both of them. That is one of the purposes of the objectives that I wanted to mention to you with respect to the difficulties regarding the equality policy and the difference with equity as a concept that orients the public policies. Thank you very much. Well, with these questions, I'm in trouble. Very quickly, I had not answered another question about how should we continue talking about racism if racism exists. Why should we continue talking about race? Because racism is this manifestation that is quite present. We cannot stop talking about it. The racism that will feed this discrimination I agree on the science, religion, policies as causes for this. And when you talk about discrimination and bullying, that's the same thing that happened in Brazil. And Bolsonaro always said when he complained about discrimination, people always complained about everything. It was a way to discredit the complaint of the other person. And that is something that is very fundamental for this. And these are the campaigns, the media, the advertisements. This has changed. The advertisements have changed, and this has an effect. The Unified Black Movement worked with so many campaigns when they wanted to fix in the censuses, the identifications. I have told you that this campaign had an enormous success. Don't let your color be overlooked. For people to reflect and to assume their color. And this was a campaign that had a very huge dimension. It was very important. How can they say in the United States that black is beautiful? There are things that have to be repeated all the time and in every context so that people can denaturalize the discrimination because discrimination is a direct aggression. That one is easy to identify. What's terrible, and this is very, very difficult to do in Brazil, was the gossiping. This was a hell. All the gossips that today we don't hear them anymore because these gossips are punishable. But before, 15 or 20 years ago, this was very common. So the camping, the insistence, the denounce, this is extremely relevant to denaturalize this. And it seems like an exaggeration, but there are many denounces. This week, for example, some people say, oh, I don't like Negroes. This is enough to be classified as a racial discrimination. And this was the result of the denaturalization. And the campaign, the media, this was super important. And sometimes the media that comes from the government transmits this message in a very important manner.
The question you asked about endoracism, interracial marriages, we should quickly point out that what we saw in Brazil historically is that there's a great proportion of interracial marriages, but this does not mean that there's no racism. And we must also remember what we talked about the whitening policy, that you need to whiten in order to go up in steps in society, and the ones that are affected the most are Black women, because it is very hard for Black women to have a relationship with white men, which does not happen the other way around. So this increases discrimination against Black women. In Brazil, they said that famous football players, as they are more important, they will find a blondie as their partner. So as you said, this starts being accepted by the Black person that believes they need to whiten themselves. And there are cases in my family, several cases of Black men that start improving, and they start looking for white women as they go. This also permeates young people, and this is one of the faces of discrimination. In the case of multilateral bodies, for example, regarding Pan-Africanism, which is discussed in Brazil, even when one of the biggest defenders came back from exile, because Brazil has always focused um, in itself regarding racial matters. There are some anthropologists that define the theory of the singularity in Brazil. The characteristics of Brazil historically are so singular that it is very hard to compare them to other countries. And I am a little bit a critic of this. Sometimes when I hear in the demonstrations in other countries, I realize, well, this also happens here in Brazil. And this also ties back to the process of colonization. But there are many intellectuals in Brazil that talk about this theory of singularity in Brazil. The 2030 agenda is trendy. In Brazil, they talk about the certificates that are required for sustainability, social sustainability, environmental sustainability, that companies have to meet these standards if they want to, especially if they want to import products, and this includes racial matters. The inclusion they must have within the companies in the private sector. I have been studying this. We would like to take advantage of the agenda to be part of the discussion in businesses, but this is such a a dangerous thing because this could fall within the category of tokenization. And with hiring just a few Black people, they call the business diverse and they give them the right to import. And that's why I defend non-discriminatory rights. So this is not only about representation. So that's why I insist in protocols. So we review the characteristics. What are the relations with these Black people? How do they get better positions with these businesses? And that's why this is part of the interrelational aspects of businesses, and this is part of the discussion. In the case of the manipulation of discourse, the African legacy, Brazil has never have discussions with Africa. Lula was the only one that had a dialogue with Lula. This is done by Lula constantly. He went to Africa and he says we must recover this part of our identity. The foundational myth of Brazil, it was done so well by the Portuguese, was that this idea, this anthropophagy, that we're all Brazilian, what you were asking about modernism. And I wanted to read some of my opinions, but would like to confirm it with studies. And for the first time, they're going to include the figure of the Black person, but they cannot escape the idea of the three races, the tale of the three races. The nation of Brazil as the result of the tale of three forces. And it seems like Brazil does not know how to look back to the past, as if the past didn't exist, and Africa is part of that past, even Europe, because it seems as if the idea of the foundation of Brazil came out of nowhere. it seems that there was a no man land, and then suddenly in the year 1500, Brazil came out of nowhere. And this is very hard because historic courses I have studied the French, the Egyptian civilizations, the Mayas. I had never studied any of these at school. Africa is completely lost, something we don't know anything about. So when the law that makes teaching African and Afro-Brazilian history mandatory at schools, it was marvelous, but we still need to continue working in training professors because this is unknown even for Black intellectuals. So this has been a very solid movement, and uh, look out because we even have African religions. We have candomblé. We have consolidated African religions. We have temples. They are recognized legally, and we have a long history background of African religions. And there was a bigger transit previously of people between Africa and Brazil, but it was very specific as it happened with Pan-Africanism. The transit along with the United States, especially with intellectuals, was much more ample. It was broadened. And there you can see that universities in Sao Paulo, in Rio, have easier ways for communicating with the United States. And Africa wants to establish networks with Brazil. In the last 20 years, especially, and public policies as equity policies, it is an interesting reflection as equity for individuals and how the state can use those principles, because otherwise it looks as if there's people isolated from that equity. And there was never equity within the state because this nation was thought for a specific sector of the population. The number of universities. There was a policy by Lula called Reúne, which gathered together universities in Brazil, and there were critiques from the academia because the issue is not creating new universities because we are risking the diminution of quality. This, however, has not been proven because some of these new universities became renowned institutions. New universities were created, new structures, new professor contests, which allowed to have a control and curricula program that's under the responsibility of the Ministry of Education. We are public servants paid by the Ministry of Education, and we work with different universities. Even if universities have autonomy, there's a possibility of, for example, me going from the University of Brasilia to work in another federal university. Nowadays, that's a little bit harder, but I am in the process of transferring to another university. So we are workers working for the Ministry of Education and not only the university itself. And the thing is that there isn't a common parameter for all of the universities. So this idea of quantity impacting quality has not been proven. And regarding vocational activities, while I am not a specialist in education or pedagogy, when I was going with the courses offered by the Black movement to help students enter university, and it's such a shame it didn't continue because I loved it as a math project. What it was said was that it is not enough to teach students only what is needed to pass the exam, the entry exam. I need to go beyond that and translate math into things kids are living in their day-to-day life, in informal sales, what their parents do. So I can not only use the math formula, but introduce elements from their day-to-day life, things they know, so I can uh, put them into examples within the class. There was something that was done in Bahia, and I loved how students learned there. The education we have is so far from the reality that they're not interested in the education that's given to them. I loved the example of the three Marias, which are the three hard subjects at school. And we must use examples from day-to-day life so they are interested. Okay, let's see what your parents work in. Oh, they're informal workers. Well, let's use examples from that. That's revolutionary. And that's one of the obstacles with education, and the right and is not able to criticize the schools created by the ministry because they have created good schools. It's translating what's in the textbooks into what they have in reality. I am from humanities. Sometimes I ask myself, why I have to study chemistry and physics so much if afterward I will not use that knowledge? But for example, in Brazil, there was a reform made by the right regarding having a more practical teaching according to vocational paths of students. But there's a very serious issue. The children of the elites have different options, for example, Portuguese, common mathematics, sociology, philosophy, and they wanted to take out these two subjects from humanities and just make other disciplines and students choose which path they would like to choose. However, the issue is that public schools have not enough professors to teach all of these disciplines. However, schools for the elites follow these models of ideology that the right are always criticizing, and public schools have to follow the reforms they are doing. This reform that was just approved in the Congress is part of the struggle Lula has, which is reversing this kind of reforms so there's an equal education, because this kind of reforms creates two different schools, two levels of training, not only regarding the level of difficulty, but also to the access to information that would only be available in one type of school. It seems like a good reform, but specialists have warned that it is dangerous because it is preventing students from having access to a wide amount of knowledge. So currently in Brazil, once the reform is approved, it is harder to reverse it. That's what Lula is trying to define what are they going to do with the reform, and he's doing that along with the Ministry of Education. Okay, let's have one more comment from here from the room, and then we will ask 3 questions from Zoom. Well, good afternoon. Thank you, Guillermo Isamar, the Simon Bolivar Institute and the Center of Social Transformation. Rebecca, thank you once again, because one of the references I always use from the second seminar is when you were talking about affirmative actions regarding education and universities, because we must have affirmative actions of inclusion, integration. But if we continue using the same education system that's not inclusive, those affirmative actions will disappear. I will read a few paragraphs that I have written. I really liked what you were discussing regarding the trans deputy and the way she educates and disseminates information. So how do we implement public policies regarding um, gender and reproductive rights beyond the point of view of the right regarding sexuality and reproduction? How do we build differentiated agenda in which we could have common points with the other side? Because sometimes we separate and isolate ourselves. And what you were saying about Freire, which is unity from diversity, going along with the praxis of honesty, especially in the political field, well, where people always say to be a politician, you must be diplomatic and that you must be fake. But I don't think that's what being a politician means. We must base ourselves in honesty. The extreme right is taking advantage of this and manipulating reality, taking advantage of the fears we have as human beings. I have a question. I know you went through the government of Bolsonaro. Which actions, considering discrimination from impunity in the state, what actions have you taken having this background of a government from the right? Some people have said that our government has given themselves to the right, and I think this is completely fake. But the affirmative actions within structures and institutions that are openly discriminatory, what you were talking about, bureaucracy and meritocracy, our colleague was expressing that. How are we going to take someone from Katia, from the west of the city, that has to take the bus, that has issues with electricity, when compared to someone that is taken to school in a car with a personal driver? And this is the product of segmentation and separation from a point of view that was born within the right, which is basic and temporary, within also the gender identity, which is an ideology that was born in the right. They categorize the left using concepts that were born within the right. And sometimes we in the left use them And since we don't have that particular revolutionary way of acting, we sometimes agree with them or react to the right. And of course, lastly, the learning and teaching from day-to-day life and not from quickness and taking into account the people that propose different things from diversity. And I say this because sometimes from our community or popular spaces in the left, if someone has a different interpretation, even if we are within the same path, we isolate and segregate that person because they don't share the same perspective or individuality we have. So thank you for the opportunity and good afternoon.
Okay, I will now read 3 questions that were posted on the chat box of Zoom so that Rebecca can make a balance on all the comments. The first question or comment is made by Solcire Perez from the state of Bolívar. Good morning, greetings to Dr. Igreja. Can you comment on what direction we could work on a legal level and what public policies we can generate in favor of the religions of African matrix in the face of the overwhelming massification of Protestantism and Orthodox religions, who have proposed a new crusade full of racial persecution. The second question or comment is made by Mary Carrasquero from the state of Aragua. The analysis has been very complete around the Brazilian territory from various perspectives, including the academic, but the challenge is to get this state of affairs to change. From the vision that you share with us, what actions do you suggest from the countries of the South committed to the cause that summons us for the weaving of a committed network that works in the political sense of the necessary achievements for the transformation both in civil and collegiate society? And finally, a question made by Jolimar Hernandez. I congratulate Rebeca Igreja for her presentation. Excellent. My question is, the Black social movements of Brazil, are they organized as citizens with international organisms for the recognition of their struggle for equality conditions for a dignified life? And what are their advancements in those encounters? These are the comments and questions for our next round of answers by Rebecca. Well, they were talking about the extreme right, the lack of trust. With all the presentations that I've made of Brazil, what has shocked us the most is how could Bolsonaro and the people from the extreme right had freedom to say things that were already punishable by law. What I said about discrimination and the racial, this was a surprise to us. And now, Bolsonaro, people now have the right to go back to be racist and confront the justice. But this came with such a large proportion that not even the justice, we didn't know how to act. And it was followed by a hatred, an uncontrolled hatred that the left, people from the left were very scared. For you to have an idea of something that was so crazy, this week we are still saying that Bolsonarism was a brainwash that made people crazy. They started to work with some policies. And in the strike that we have right now in the University of the De Campina, there's a strike right now. And a professor took out a knife and he went to attack the young people with the knife, something that was totally crazy. Last week, a man in a bus had a knife and was screaming, and he was saying, "We do this sign for to represent Lula." And he was also threatening with killing the people. People are armed. So that was something that got to such an extreme that we went to a restaurant or to the subway and we didn't know if we would dress in red, if we could talk loud, because people were ready to attack violently. This had never been seen before. It wasn't an attack of the force of the military servicemen of the state. It was the attack of the people themselves. During Lula's campaign, I would never imagine to put on my car a sticker of Lula to 2023 because then they would scratch all the car, they would break the windows. This was a production of hatred of the extreme right, and it was gigantic. The family raptors were not only to stop talking, but they were physical aggressions. They invaded the universities and they threatened professors to death all the time. And they screamed. And we had never lived this before. We had lived that from the military servicemen, but not from the people. We were even scared of our neighbors. That is something that was new to us. And this is something that continues to be practiced. And this generates a lot of fear among people. This intensifies hatred because it's not just a matter of not accepting the ideology of gender and different sexualities. It is a matter that we have to be careful. We have to be careful because your son will be forced to change his or her sex. And this happens all the time. Imagine a family that is conservative. They run crazy. They're willing to commit crimes to defend their families because the ideologists are going to transform their son into a homosexual. So, how can we respond to this collective craziness? If you watch the videos of the Bolsonaro supporters during the campaign, they had a cell phone towards the car to call the extraterrestrial to save Brazil. You thought it was a joke, that they were crazy, but no, thousands of people did this in a serious manner. So it's a collective paranoia that was generated in Brazil. And so far, we have not been able to understand how to treat this. People are scared, people are desperate because to them, we are like the devil. And I have talked to you about something that happened last week about a priest that went to a possession of Afro identity and he hired an artist and he said that he represented the devil, that he was in the body of Lula and his wife. I mean, people are now crazy. People are scared. So all those rights that you commented, we are not able to discuss them. When we talk about abortion, for example, the idea is that now the physicians are going to force all women to go through abortion. And you talk to people and you explain to them this doesn't exist. And people are blind. Now, how have they been able to produce this level of fear and hatred? We don't know. And this does not only happen in Brazil, it is happening in Europe and in the US. People are willing to physically attack. and we are scared. We live with a lot of fear during his government because we couldn't trust absolutely anyone. And the justice has not been able to act because the dimension was so large, it was so scary that it was impossible. The pandemic also affected the education of the the poorest people who had no computers. This is the best example for us of the fragility, of the absolute fragility of our democracy, of our policies. We trusted so much on how much we had advanced, but suddenly we found out that everything was quite fragile. We can lose our rights from one minute to another faster than the time that it took for us to conquer it. So this is very complicated. And I am very shameful when I see the deputies that defend the LGBTQ plus causes and the National Congress because they are attacked internally. There's a lot of aggression. We have to remember that Brazil, that seems to be a liberal country, is the country that kills more transgender people in the world. This is something that shocks people. We are a violent country, masked by a society where the people seem to be very happy, but in reality, we are a violent country and we have to treat that violence. Violence is really included in our country, and this is very important. How can we eliminate this violent way to react on our daily lives? This is super important. It's not just the violence of the crime, it's the daily violence. We are violent. There are many ideas. I don't know if I am answering your questions. Latin America is very violent, and so we need to work on the idea of the violence. Regarding African religions, I'm going to put this a little bit more complicated based on what I said the first day. The problem is when we see that the vast majority of people who go to church, evangelical churches, are Black people. So suddenly you see Black people against the African religions because the churches that grew, the neo Pentecostal, like the one that is universal of God that was born in Bahia, grew by attacking the Afro cults. They made a campaign against the cults. They took money from the people, and it was very important. And the rituals of this church, like the Universal Church, there are some entities that are more typical than Ubanda and the Ashus. And the cults, the Neo-Pentecostals, like the universal ones, people invoke these Afro entities to make these ceremonies and rituals, saying that they're devils. And I saw people from the family of my former husband who worked, who were mothers, and who became evangelical. And they started to say that everything was due to the devil. And I wondered, all your work that you made for years, how can you categorize it as something from the devil? I mean, sometimes you just are speechless. How can you explain that to them? But there is something that is very important, and that is that the church becomes your family. The financial support, financial for children. So it's necessary to have the presence of the state. It is necessary for the left to make this ground root work. They have to work with the young people. There is now a survey in Brazil where more than half of the young people do not believe in politics. They don't believe in democracy. We have to go back to politicize the youngsters to take them out of the churches. The youngsters need to be politicized. And this is very important. The discourse of the extreme right is a discourse that supports the end of the policy. What the left has to do is to make them believe that politics is in everything, that politics are important. And I don't want to homogenize this. This is not majority, but there are priests who supported Lula. There's a pastor, bishop, who is from the left and who has been very important now that they want to revert the homosexual marriage. Enrique, the pastor, has been very important in the National Congress because he has defended the rights of the homosexual marriage. There was a very hard critique of the Deus that was being defended by other pastors of the Congress. They had this manipulation of the Christianism. So we always have to be careful in order not to generalize as if this happened in our evangelical churches, because this is not the case. We cannot become intolerant ourselves. I believe that this change to make a network, the most important thing is to get to know ourselves better and to work together. But there is a critique that I always make. We are always towards the north. I mean, there's always an intellectual of the northern hemisphere that connects with us. There's always someone from the northern there's always a meeting that connects all intellectuals. We are always in debt. How can we say this in Spanish? I don't know if you say it. We turn a northern intellectual into God, an intellectual who seems he's going to save Latin America. And it's very curious. I was joking here. I found Jimena in Paris, in a meeting that they had invited us. So I always believe that it is necessary for us to start to meet together more, with the difficulty that we don't have the funds, the economical funds that the Northern Hemisphere has for these meetings. And it is necessary, it is very difficult, but it's necessary for us to start to make investigations that go beyond our national context. It is very nice when a student of a country makes a field work in another country. That person, based on his perspective, is going to analyze another reality. Because if I come to Venezuela to make a field work like the one I did in Mexico, of course, I have my perspective in Brazil, my ideas of Brazil, and that is very important. This is something that has to be done. It's not a matter of me coming here to talk about Brazil. It would be good for some students to go to Brazil and make some field work, for them to travel, for them to say, I know the reality of my country, but now I'm going to learn another reality. Because the people from the Northern Hemisphere does this with us. The Northern people make the theories and we offer the field data for them. We don't need to work field works in Europe and the United States. And do theories about them and to say things. The problem is that we don't have resources, and it's not only a lack of resources. I read the history many times with government agencies financing research that only financed, and I will give a specific example. I had a project in Central America. I wanted scholarships for my students to make a field work in Cambodia, and they answered, no, Rebecca, we have scholarships for Europe for other students, and it was for students of Nicaragua. So it was difficult. It is important to have those students having knowledge. It was ridiculous. I was looking for scholarships for Europe in order to help people, in order to have resources to send my students from Brazil to Nicaragua, Costa Rica, Guatemala.
So you can have a government from the left, but if the public education agencies don't think that the only valuable place to invest in is Europe. So I'm sorry, but if you just go to Europe to learn theories and then come back, because sometimes I have friends that go to Europe.
Aí me parece padríssimo, porque vamos poder verificar se as teorias europeias funcionam em seus próprios países, porque às vezes
And
não
sometimes they don't go to Latin American centers. But I think it is good when you go there to see if the European theories actually work. So it is very complex to change this situation. So we must listen to our own intellectuals without the intervention from a person from the north. And regarding the Black movement, we must be very careful when talking about it. The Brazilian Black movement is historical. It has been working for centuries and has always been very solid in Brazil. And the only thing in the recent years that we're afraid of, and I will be very careful so I don't speak in a general fashion, but we constantly talk about creating NGOs within the Black and the social movements, because once you create NGOs and you link international bodies to those foundations, and I am not criticizing the reason why they do it, because they need the funds, but they are fragmenting themselves. And I am going to give you an example. There's a commission in the National Congress to review NGOs in Brazil and their expenses. They currently have their commission there, which is very complex because many times they receive resources from the government. They have received resources from the government of Lula. And you know, that's very complex, receiving funds, public resources. We are desperate when doing the accountability because you must have specialists to provide all the documents, all the receipts. It's like working with the indigenous people. You pay something and there's a protocol to move from a place to another, and then they ask for a receipt, but we say, what kind of receipt the indigenous people are going to give us? So that's a nightmare. And sometimes I say we will not receive any more public resources. And what has happened? Some NGOs have received public resources and they haven't completed the accountability process. This usually creates issues within the social movement. And what we see in Brazil is that these NGOs were affected, and there was a lot of competence between the year 2000 until nowadays, and this affects the social movement and its independence. And when we start to verify this growing movement through the youth, the linked bodies, in a way to fight against violence, see their role at schools. But you must be careful because during the Durban, discussing the Durban situation, there was a lot of financing from international bodies, and They put NGOs at a vulnerable position with account issues and putting their independence in risk. It's unfortunate, but the social movement and its freedom cannot depend on the state or foundations. So the question is how to survive. We must ask ourselves how to renovate social movements and how to deal with this context within social movement, because sometimes international foundations are great at offering resources. There's one in Brazil, it is called Lema. It is one of the richest in the world. They created by one of the richest organizations in the world, and they created the Foundation Lema for creating education projects. But recently, there was a great fraud discovered within their taxation. And what they did is that they organized the youth from the favela, and they wanted to give political education, and they looked at Harvard, and they are from the left. Harvard follows the left. And some of those young people came back as deputies. But the owners of this foundation have a liberal point of view, and those young people have a liberal point of view of the state. But how could we imagine that the Lema Foundation would have political training in the United States for young people from the left? However, they offer a lot of financing for social movement, and that's why we must reshape social movement. What it is, how it is defined, how did you create it? Yesterday, I received an article in Portuguese. You can translate it on Google from a union sociologist regarding the discussion of Brazil, which is what is the left? Because the political left has been defined according to special rights. And nowadays, unionism is a an old left that no longer has a space in the country. So we changed the definition of what is the left. And this even sees Lula as an antique left. And this union defensor wrote an article that stated we are going to be part of the discussion of what the left is. Because nowadays it seems as if the left is only about defending specifics. So we must stop this and ask ourselves, what's the left? Is the union antique, old-fashioned? If we have NGOs that are regarding sexual rights, Black rights, and we must thank them, of course, for giving us all of these labor rights because they come from the unions. But she tries to put the discussion, and I thought her effort is great, trying to tie these struggles of identity with the principles and the constitution of the left. So we must go back and discuss these aspects, and I think that's it.
Bueno, creo que nos quedan una lista de ideas, de tareas.
Well, I think we now have a list of ideas and tasks we must continue debating. We in our country ideas brought by Rebecca, her reflections, experiences, but also the situation of a country that it seems we don't know much about, but we have many similar obstacles, issues, and we have to learn a lot from that country. We must work on discrimination, working against discrimination, and laws tend to punish racists, but they are not struggling against racism. This also happens with domestic violence. So we see, for example, rapists as a psychopath that must be punished, and once that is done, we feel there's a success, but we don't question the patriarchy and its system that generated that rapist. We have the topic of the churches. We have the proposal that was made today, and we must work on that. We're not giving churches the importance they have and the impact they can have on our day-to-day life. The topic of NGOs and the financing that's sometimes hidden. We don't know where their money is coming from, and sometimes it looks as it is positive because they say, okay, they brought money, but that always comes with a specific language, vision, direction that can be dangerous and has proven to be dangerous. And we haven't had positive experiences related to that. At the end of this month, we will have the last national encounter on reparations, where everyone responsible for the projects that are being financed will meet. And this is a space in which we can start elaborating strategies and plans to continue this struggle. There was a summon from the Science Ministry for a project on reparations, and the investigation line was built by the ones that attended the seminar. The minister assumed that project, and they have started to be executed. And this is a space of union in which we all meet. So today we finished this session and the seminar, at least for this year. I would like to deeply thank Rebecca for sharing her experiences, her ideas, her feelings with us. It's been very knowledge, the knowledge transformation, which is part
Que aprovecho para y tenemos las traducciones al inglés y al francés.
I would like to take advantage recorder on YouTube and simultaneous interpretation into French and English, because we must have we've
presente.
And let's remember, we can organize our And we must go beyond the patriarchy, racism, and in order to do that, we must convince ourselves
regresan, son al Congreso, pero son neoliberales.
that way the members of our youth, the Congress, but turns out they're neoliberal. And everyone here are responsible of building all of that. And I will give the floor to Aisamar. And I would like to thank the militants of this seminar that have been attending the activities in order to strengthen everyone. Well, I would like to reiterate our gratitude to Rebecca, everyone who attended both in person and online. We would like to invite of the dialogue by the Social Transformation Center that will be held every Friday of this month in the National Art Gallery. We will be talking about health from the South, environmental issues, social issues, and this is, of course, related to everything we have been talking about during the week. Rebecca will be with us today. This activity starts today. Everyone is invited, and it will start at 2 p.m. So Rebecca can close. So very quickly, I would like to deeply thank your invitation. It's been a pleasure to be with you today. Be here in Caracas, seeing a different reality. I will go back to Brazil with different ideas. Guillermo has my contact information. If you need anything in Brazil, you can write me an email. I am always available, and I would like to thank your welcoming. It has been a pleasure to be with you today.